Good afternoon and welcome to the closing plenary session of the conference. We're doing this, as I said at lunch, this is something we've never done before. And I don't see him here so I can talk about him. Roy Greenaway, who has been with the center as an advisor, as a good friend personally into the center for a number of years, has always been needling us that we have all these great discussions in different panels, but we never bring people together at the very end to sort of share whatever lessons, whatever common themes that have come up. So we're doing it this time around, and we have the participants up here are all at the panels, either panelists or attendees. And I think what we should do is somewhat go in the order of the day. But let me introduce everybody first. Covering the first panel, .com, Cyber Communities and Wired Government, the E-Future of California. We have Richard Chabran, Director of the Center for Virtual Research at UC Riverside. This is the Riverside Day up here. We have the senator from Riverside, and we have UC Riverside. Second on the panel, electoral disinterest. Can the internet stimulate voting and interest in politics? We have Shervan Balorian, who was with the Center for Southern California Studies at CSU Northridge, our partner in the South and a co-sponsor of the conference. But I think he's left the center for a year, and he will be starting as one of our fellows in a month or so. Third, for the panel on the master plan for the 21st century, higher education and public policy, we have Michael Ross, who is an attorney, who is an author of an excellent book on California state and local government. It's up from San Diego and is a longtime supporter of the center. For unorthodox communities, mapping the real California, Jackie Donath had to leave on a family thing, and so I'm going to read her notes and try not to shame her. For a fifth panel, the Great California Experiment, Populations and Electorates, we have one of the panelists, Kevin Nguyen of the American Civil Rights Institute, and another former fellow. And finally, for a republic or democracy, legislatures in the electronic future, we have Karen Getman, chair of the Fair Political Practices Commission. So let me start with Richard, and what I've asked all the panelists to do is just very briefly summarize the major points of discussion, not what everybody, and Tim said this and George said this, but to summarize the major thrust of the discussion. So Richard.
Thank you. This will be very short, but basically the first point that I would want to summarize is that Steve Nissen talked about how in many ways California was somewhat behind in terms of beginning the road down e-government, but that things are quickly changing and that in fact we have some really important developments within California, one example of which is people can register, the DMV is online now, and that there's going to be a lot more of that kind of developments that are going to be taking place in California. The second theme is that in order for us to have all of our California citizens participate in e-government, that we're going to have e-inclusion. And under that, various panelists talked about the need for people to have access to the tools that allow them to participate, that they will have to know how to use those tools, what we call technological fluency, that there will be relevant content available for them, and under that, the recognition that sometimes that means different kind of languages, different kind of cultural perspectives. Also an acknowledgement that in using these new technologies that we have to attend to the different learning styles that are present within our population. Another theme was that these new technologies are going to need to be assimilated into various service delivery, whether it's health or politics or education, and how all of that takes place will have an impact on how e-government is transformed. Another theme was that was really important in terms of the e-government, that we want to make sure the presence of people still communicating with each other, and so the notion of high tech and high touch. And finally, that in terms of this whole development, that there was a vital need for public and private partnerships in terms of the development and of both the services and the training and the whole building out of this new thing that we're going to be calling e-government. So those are some of the themes that came out of our panel.
Thank you, Richard. Shervin?
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
Thank you. You'll have to forgive me. I was a couple of minutes late, and I apologize about that. But, I'm a little bit nervous about this. This was sort of sprung on me a couple of days ago. So
I think we drafted him.
so I've been rehearsing outside for this. So it's a big deal for me. So anyway, it's my distinct honor and privilege to be here representing the Center for Southern California Studies at Cal State Northridge, who are one of the co-sponsors of this conference. I'm also most excited to have been selected as one of the 2000-2001 Capital Fellows. I'm very much looking forward to that. I've been asked to give you a brief summary of this morning's panel on electoral disinterest. The question: can the internet stimulate voting and interest in politics? The panel was moderated by Kim Alexander, Executive Director of the California Voter Foundation. Her organization is a nonprofit that has been promoting public access to reliable voter information on the internet since 1994. The first panelist, Alfie Charles, he works for the California Secretary of State. He discussed how the information revolution has made unprecedented progress, including such steps as the availability of forms, data, information, including campaign finances, donations. Mr. Charles was also a consultant on the John McCain presidential campaign. He attributed much of Mr. McCain's success during the primaries to a dynamic and informative website that not only gave web users contact information and such, but it also served as a watershed, a virtual campaign headquarters, where opportunities were available for media, volunteers, and donors. Essentially, Mr. McCain's camp was able to manage a large-scale grassroots campaign through interactive web meetings, email correspondence, and networking. An efficient operation run at minimum cost, which ultimately can bring hope to those who wish to seek office who are working on a limited budget. Moving on to Justin Trinhalpin, he is Executive Director of Kids Vote in California. You'll forgive me, I know you told me not to try and highlight all of them, but this is the format I chose. His program is a curriculum-based civics education initiative designed to engage K-12 students in the election process. Kids voting brings politics to public schools. It opens doors to less affluent groups, and it generates interest among parents. Mr. Trinhalpin emphasized, however, that e-government cannot be viewed as an online solution to voter apathy. Technology is merely another tool at our disposal. It can only be viewed as a training mill for democracy. Finally, Professor Don Taylor from the Department of Communication Studies at Sacramento State raised some rather critical points, challenging the advances that the information society has made. Dr. Taylor affirmed that the internet requires new literacy, renewed familiarization with tools, but if we are to have an informed citizenry, then equitable access to resources is essential, and here's where the problem lies. Studies reveal major socio-economic differences between, as he would put it, the class of information haves and the class of information have-nots, otherwise known as the digital divide. Race and income are two significant variables. The consequences promise to be severe for the economy and social infrastructure of America. There is also a divide existent within the content of the information that is available. Dr. Taylor argued that there is very little cultural appeal, very little cultural relevance to much of what is available. He offers several propositions to bridge the divide, including more public-private partnerships, more culturally relevant indicators, a market approach, and more research on the matter. So in sum, there's much for us to fear. There's much for us to be cautious about. There's much for us to be wary of when it comes to the so-called technological space age that is being played out before us. But there's also a tremendous amount of hope, a tremendous amount of possibility, of opportunity. And we can look forward to that. The internet can engage citizens. The answer is yes. But the question remains, will it make us a more responsible citizenry? Thanks.
Thank you. Michael.
The master plan for higher education in California was written in 1960, and the issue before this panel was, is the master plan still appropriate for California in the year 2000? As many of you know, California in 1960 was far, far different from California in the year 2000. And the three panelists were a knowledgeable spokesman for the University of California, the state university system, and the community college system. And each of them was asked to name the three most important issues facing their respective system. And if I may summarize their comments, the three issues that emerged were, first, the disparity of high school students' preparation for higher education. How well you can do in college, how well you're prepared for college may vary greatly depending on the location of your high school. Rural versus urban, inner city versus suburban, that sort of thing. Second, the state's profound need for a scientifically trained workforce. Employers out there are clamoring for employees who are technically literate. And third, the changing demographic composition of California's higher education students. Different kinds of people, people with different demographic characteristics, are going to college in the year 2000 as opposed to those going to college in 1960. One of the very interesting points that came out is that when you compare California with other states, we have a very, very high percentage of people being admitted to four-year colleges, but an extraordinarily low percentage of people actually graduating later. There's a whole lot of people fall through the cracks once they get into the four-year college. Another important theme that came up again and again was the relationship between the community colleges and the University of California and the state university system. Now, maybe I was just listening more carefully because I teach in a community college, but this came up again and again. Notice that one of the things that was part of the 1960 master plan was that the legislators and the governor were hoping that people would first go to a community college near their home and get their lower division education there and then go to the University of California or the state universities. Well, at least as far as the University of California, it didn't happen. But I noticed that there was an article in the San Diego Union Tribune. The UC San Diego has a rather large number of community college transfers that started this month, and it's far more than they had in the past, and they're anticipating even more in the future. So in a sense, inadvertently, we're moving in the direction of the what the master plan had in mind. Also, the legislature has approved a plan, very interesting, that a high school junior who does very well can be told that you have a guaranteed spot at the University of California, but you can first go to a community college near your home. If you fulfill the requirements, the courses that we want you to take at the community college, you're guaranteed a spot at the University of California after you finish the community college. It's a very interesting idea. They also pointed out that the CSU system is very, very heavily dependent on community college transfers. 2/3 of the people who graduate from the CSU system started out initially in the community colleges, and that is the highest rate for the nation as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Unorthodox Community Mapping the Real California was a panel which I actually had some hand in at least getting onto the agenda. The brochure paragraph, I think, says what we wanted to do, and that was, this is a census year, which means that next year the legislature is constitutionally required, both under state and federal constitutions, to redraw congressional, Senate, Assembly districts to ensure equal population. The criteria for doing that, with the exception of some federal voting rights laws and the population equality, is also spatial geography. Compact, contiguous, and what we wanted to do is bring a group of people together, compact, contiguous, and I might add, as I said in the brochure, the controlling state case law, in the opinion of the California State Supreme Court, is that California has 4 regions, and only 4. And no community or no legislative or congressional district should ever cross the borders between these 4 regions. And I see all of you looking around at the maps. One of the reasons we get the maps in is the 4 regions are North Coastal, North Inland, South Coastal, South Inland. So, for example, a district that includes any part of the city of San Diego or any part of the county of San Diego cannot include Imperial County. A district that includes San Luis Obispo County cannot go in and pick up anything in the valley. Note how few of the maps we have here obey that constitution or that court mandate. So, in the discussion at that panel, focused on several major themes. First was, why are we mapping? And Terry, if you want to jump in and tell me when I'm wrong, please feel free to. But why are we mapping? What sorts of imaginative maps could we develop? What type of practical maps could we develop? How can we best position human communities vis-a-vis their geographic realities, their natural resources, their socio-political concerns and interests? What kind of representation are we talking about? Geographical representation is what the system is based on. Perhaps we ought to move and redefine representation so we're not representing an entity called San Luis Obispo County or Sacramento County. What does the physical representation of a community really look like? And if we are forced to do these types of maps, how is the best map drawn that would, even though it's spatial and geographically based, still have some sense of of representing everything, the complexity, the water, the fauna, the hydrological, the geographic, the geological characteristics, human characteristics of a community. And that was our panel. No, Kevin.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks for sticking around till the little session. Our session talked about the changing demographics of California and what that means for our political and social future. We talked about terms like emerging population, which some argue reflects probably the ethnic and racial groups that are that have the greatest rate of increase, i.e. Latinos, Chicanos, and Asian Americans. And we contrasted those groups with an aging white and black population that has enjoyed essentially dominance in the political process because the electorate represents essentially older and more educated voters. And looking at that electorate, we try to talk about the various governmental institutions that we have, as well as the initiatives that have driven policy and driven politics in the last 2 decades, or even in the last 4 to 6 years. We talked about the Illegal Immigration Initiative 187, the Racial Preference Initiative 209, Bilingual Education 227, and some of the current ones we have dealing with decriminalization of marijuana and vouchers, and how that drives voter turnout. And we were able to come up with a couple of points of speculation. One is that institutions like the legislature is going to keep changing to reflect a new dynamic, not just demographic, but in terms of a political dynamic. What I mean by that is we have still unresolved an issue regarding the blanket primary, which produces more and more candidates who are centrist, who engage more in coalition building, who reach across racial and ethnic lines, and that results in more candidates winning elections in districts that are increasingly quote-unquote majority-minority. And we're looking at that dynamic and see how that changes a legislature that has been characterized 2 ways. Sometimes it's a contradiction, but in one way, the legislature is more reflective of the ethnic and racial diversity of the state. But in another way, the legislature is not reflective of the viewpoints of the state as a whole, and definitely of the electorate as a whole. For example, issues like Prop 209 and the P9 initiative, Prop 22, would not have ever made it out of the legislature, but yet they were passed overwhelmingly when put up to a vote. And you're going to see that sort of contradiction as the legislature undergoes a change that's caused in large part by term limits. And then we ended up the panel discussion trying to speculate what this means for our future. And we talked about the concept of majority-minority, where in the last census, Hispanics are now the largest minority in the state, and there's no one ethnic or racial group that comprises 51% of the population. And that trend is going to mean again, more candidates being voted in districts in which the candidate is not going to be the same, is not going to be a member of the dominant ethnic or racial group. You'll have, like in the case of Oakland, Audie Bach, a white official representing a large black population. Or you'll have in Sacramento, one of our panelists was Lauren Hammond, who is a black council member whose district is very diverse, reflective of the state, but is majority white. So what that means is that we're going to get probably less ethnic block voting, because the concept of race or ethnicity is going to sort of unravel along with the tremendous rate of intermarriage and mixed race births. And at the same time, we're also recognizing that within ethnic and racial groups, there is a diversity of views. Latinos, for example, are more conservative on a lot of social issues and voted more overwhelmingly for the Pete Knight initiative than the state did as a whole. And so when we challenge these preconceived notions of race and ethnicity, we're going to have to strike a new dynamic and perhaps find new terms in the 21st century.
Thanks, Kevin. Kevin DeCarry.
Our panel, which was the last one, talked about legislatures in the electronic future, and the question that we asked initially are what are the implications of the computer age for a Republican form of government that's characteristic of the state legislature. The first panelist, who's sitting to my left, started the discussion by saying that there was an undeniable and unstoppable pressure for e-democracy. And his fellow panelists seemed to agree with that. That was the premise of the discussion, was that no matter what we thought about whether it was good or bad public policy, there was no question but that we would see direct voting by people in front of their computers on issues of public importance. That was, in some senses, just a continuum of something that had begun with the movement toward direct voting for the presidency, and in California toward direct voting on initiatives, and now we would have direct voting on any one of a number of issues currently handled by the legislature. And people would in effect use technology to bypass the legislative process. That raised concern for a number of things. One of our panelists, Senator Haynes, talked about the viewpoint of Madison in the Federalist Papers, that if you have an unrestrained democracy, such as a direct democracy, that's as likely to result in repression of the minority as is a dictatorship. And so we spent a great deal of time discussing what one could do to ensure that that repression did not take place. If there could be some kind of safeguards, electronic safeguards, that in essence would replace the safeguards of the current Republican form of government that we have in the legislature. Some of those safeguards were things like a cooling off period before your vote or your signature actually counted, creating perhaps jurisdictional boundaries, increasing the role of the judiciary in serving as the ultimate check on the laws that would be enacted by people directly. There was some concern about abuse of the process by moneyed interests and powerful interests. And there also seemed to be some consensus among the panelists that that was taking place now and it was inevitable in the future. The consideration wasn't whether you could have a system in which you guaranteed 100% security and privacy, but rather a system much like the current one in which you did as much as you could to have those guarantees. And that was really what we were going to be faced with, making sure that we could guarantee those. We talked about some of the technological ways of guaranteeing, for instance, that it was really you who were voting by your computer. There's also some concern, obviously, about corruption and corruption of the process. But again, that's the consensus seemed to be that there was a potential for corruption in any form of political system, and that wasn't a reason not to go forward with it. And even if you were concerned about corruption of this process, the train had already left the station. And I think that's a short but sweet summary.
Well, before we open it up to questions from you and other additional comments from the panel, it strikes me that Shervin sort of put his finger on what, if we wanted to summarize, or at least from my viewpoint, if I want to summarize all of our discussions, there's much to be wary of, but there's much hope and many opportunities. The themes I see from everybody is concerned about how the web and e-democracy in terms of campaigns can reinvigorate a lot of voter interest. But at the same time, we have to be very, very careful to make sure that it's equal access and that we don't rush into a political system or political tools, communication tools, that will leave behind a grand number of people. And remind you of what our lunch speaker said, 40% of all Native Americans in this country who live on reservations are without telephones. And we're talking about seamless digital internet, everything. And 40% of all Native Americans living on reservations do not have telephones. That's a real divide. That we have challenges in education, both in terms of meeting the needs of the state, addressing, again, the sort of disparity, the divide between those high schools that can adequately prepare those students for college and those who can't. But then the hopes, the chances of doing these things. You know, as Michael pointed out, the UC making this proposal where we guarantee you a slot if you complete the 2 years, which is a very, you know, I can't answer that. That is a landmark move, in part because 5 years ago there was no agreement in California between the UC, the CSU, and the community colleges as to what courses could actually count if you transferred. Right? And so what would happen is there'd be thousands every year, thousands of CSU students wanting to transfer to UC, the community college students wanting to go to the CSU or the UC, and they'd find that any number of units that they took, they'd have to take over again because it wasn't transferable. Well, now we have an agreement, an arrangement to do that. That's hopeful. The realities of the divisions in terms of our growing ethnic and racial mixes, but then the hopeful part of it of saying, you know, Adibaku may or may not be around too much longer, but Jerry Brown also, you know, two whites who represent a very, very racially and economically and ethnically diverse community. Lauren Hammond, who was on the panel, does not represent an African American area in Sacramento. She represents a very ethnically mixed area. And I think even in our panel where we were talking about the perils of e-democracy a lot, and saying it's inevitable, but we're also, I think, at the end in particular, there was a sense of, well, Tracy Weston managed to lay out just off the top of his head several ways that we could make this happen. So instead of saying e-democracy is incompatible with what James Madison wrote in 1790, what we say is, okay, if James Madison was writing today, how would he construct e-checks and balances to go along with e-democracy? So again, hopeful. But I will say, in honor of our panel, we mentioned Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, Plato, Aristotle, but we missed Augustine and Aquinas and Machiavelli.
On a cyber candidate.
Right.
That was when we stopped the panel, the thought of a cyber legislator.
The
We
comment,
also spent a great deal of time, we also mentioned Bill Gates.
yes.
Okay? Bill Gates in the same conversation with Jefferson, Madison, and think about that.
The cyber candidate comment was, there are websites that you can log on to now where you can say, these are my core values, 1, 2, 3, 4, fill out a little survey, and this is where I live, this is my zip code, and they will send back to you, if the candidate, if they have the data for that particular district, who they think which candidate meets your preferences. Right? And so then that went to the next comment, which was, well, why not just run a software program and load in the different factors and run the software program for office and say all you would do is plug in the bill and the program will spit out a yes or no vote.
That's not that different from some experiences I've had working on several political campaigns where people have said, I really like your candidate, who does he or she recommend I vote for down the ticket? It's just a higher tech version.
Well, I think there's the websites are similar to that, or a slate mailer, or, you know, League of Women Voters puts out positions on initiatives, not on candidates. I think it is a little different to say, okay, we're going to elect a software package. And the most horrible thing was mentioned was the idea of somebody come up with the idea of a software package to replace legislative staffers. I don't care anymore. I'm not one anymore. So, comments from the panel. Questions. Comments. We wanted to try to get your sense of what you learned. I mean, on a postcard to your grandmother that you're going to write tomorrow morning, what did you learn from the conference? What did you do today?
Was anybody scared? That was one of the questions that our panel had. Was anybody scared at the thought of all of this? Anybody think it's just a really bad idea? Yeah?
You had your hand up in the green.
I had a question, but finish yours first. I had a question that I didn't have time to ask at the panel. Growth is a major challenge for the higher education system in California. So I'm wondering, why are so many colleges and universities actively recruiting international students to come to our institution?
Because they want engineers. America can't produce engineers or very technical kinds of people. Not anymore. Not in the year 2000. They may have been able to do it in 1960. But I work in the Golden Triangle area of San Diego, and there's all kinds of high-tech firms in the area, Qualcomm being the most famous. But you'd be amazed how many of their employees are from India or from Europe, France, for example. There's this crying need of employers have for engineers and high-tech computer people, and they can't get them from America. They've got to go to India to get them.
Yeah, it may not just be, I mean, that's a good point, but it may also have to do with income, how the colleges, this is the only way they make their money, really, is through the international student programs where they can charge students 100 and something plus per unit, plus a ridiculous amount of tuition. I used to be a foreign student myself, so I can complain, but yeah, that's the way that they make a profit.
Jerry?
Well, the foreign students enrich the student body mix. You have people with quite different life experiences, and it's a good idea.
Jerry?
Well, I had a question really from the last panel, and if there's a frustration of people with representative government now, and you could argue that government now is more representative than it ever has been, at least with the sophistication of polling techniques and the scientific precision in which these software packages can determine a representative sample of the population and what their opinions are, and that people complain about their representatives being, in a sense, too responsive. They just do whatever the people want. If the attraction of e-democracy is that people will be able to vote, it would seem to me that vote directly, that people will be experiencing the same degree of disillusionment and frustration with that process that they have presently with the process, that it's manipulated, and that because it's odd that people criticize their representatives because they do what people who vote for them want them to do. And that if they participate directly in that, will they have any more confidence about the results? Is there a real qualitative difference in the level of satisfaction with government in the future?
Yeah, I think we didn't touch on it, but I think it's a fascinating question. The assumption is that, I think Jefferson was the one that said this, there's nothing wrong with democracy that more democracy can solve.
Thomas Dewey. It was Dewey.
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 It's one of those quotes that you can ascribe to almost everybody, but So Dewey said that. But is that going to be true? I mean, if we suddenly had a system where we could all vote on the 3,000 bills that go through this building in a 2-year session, are we going to be happy? Are we going to be satisfied with it? Are we going to feel that the voice of the people triumphed, even though my voice was on the losing end? Right? Or is there going to be that willingness, or is it going to be, well, obviously somebody wired the system, programmed it right, so because I couldn't possibly have been wrong. I mean, my position is the right position. That's fascinating. We didn't touch on that, but I think it's a very I mean, it's difficult to draw historical analogies because we've never had anything like this. And Tracy Weston, I think, did a wonderful job of always sort of, bringing back and saying, well, okay, well, it's true that television harmed the sense of community because we all sit in the rooms, but the internet necessarily doing this because there's all these cyber communities that are very real. But my readings of history are that there's very few examples of a democracy where everybody was just really, really happy all the time.
Plus, I suppose you'd have to get rid of the courts. I mean, that is one thing that we did touch upon, which is you have all these people voting directly on bills, and then it's like the initiative process now. They get to the court system, and they tend to get declared unconstitutional.
My vote is always well-informed based on analysis, but all the other people are manipulated by special interests.
There's an outfit down in L.A. called the Josephson Institute for Ethics, and they always do this poll every year, and I always find it fascinating. They go into a group, like everybody in this room, and asked to rate themselves. In other words, rate yourself on how ethical you are. Generally speaking, are you very ethical, rarely ethical? And then rate everybody else in the room. How ethical do you think they are? And inevitably, they've been doing this now for 10, 15 years, the polls come back, everybody thinks they're significantly above average. They're very ethical. I don't know about that. So,
Same thing about driving, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a good driver, you're not. Well, it's an interesting thing about the how happy we would be on it.
Everybody says their kid is above average.
Yeah.
One thing about this e-democracy, now I didn't attend the panel, but is the idea that the public at large would pass legislation, pass constitutional amendments? Is that the idea?
Well, yeah. The e-democracy movement, and it's probably not organized enough to say it's a movement, but ranges from groups that simply want the initiative processes we have here in all 50 states and in all the local jurisdictions. But Tracy Weston laid out, I think, to me, a very plausible scenario. There's an initiative that qualifies, puts on the ballot, and is passed that says you can sign initiative petitions online. I mean, you can register to vote online now, so you ought to be able to sign an initiative online. Then
You can request a voter registration form online.
that's right. But the initiative would be you can sign a petition online. Right? Secondly, the next initiative would be you ought to be able to vote on these initiatives online because we're moving, I mean, there's technical feasibility questions, security questions rather, but, we'll work out something. And then the third initiative would be you can vote on this initiative that you help qualify online and that you voted for online, and it will be up for a vote within 30 days after it's qualified. So you don't have to wait a year for the general election ballot. Instant e-democracy in California. And I think that's what, I think that's a very plausible Tracy Weston scenario. Not necessarily, he didn't say I want to be fair to Tracy, he didn't say, this is going to happen. He said, this is a plausible scenario about how it might happen. And there certainly are groups out there who are advocating exactly that.
One thing I would say, there's all this discussion on the technical feasibility of e-democracy, but this is a fundamental and basic change in American government, because what Madison wanted was a republic, that the decisions on public policy would be made by the people in this building. And if you don't like the decisions they make, you kick them out when they come up for election again. But notice this is a basic, fundamental constitutional change in American government, because the decision is not being made by 120 people that we've selected, but by everybody who pushes a button on their computer. Fundamental change.
I would just want to underscore what, in our panel, we talked about a lot, that a lot of people don't have access, and really access to information that's maybe even understandable to them if they don't speak the language that might not be available online. So the issues of literacy and access, will be critical. Otherwise, what kind of democracy are we promoting, because we can technically do something. And also the other thing that was also pointed out was by Senator Bowen, is that there's this, there seems to be this kind of relationship between privacy and so that, and this kind of electronic voting, so that in order to make something more secure, you have to say more about yourself. And yet that's the way you're going to be able to guarantee that it's secure. So so it's not something that's really, that we can say with certainty that we can do this in the near future. And I think also, the other part that was pointed out is that, this whole issue about privacy and the selling of information that's available online, government wants to really be an exception to that. And, so these kinds of things have not really been worked out yet. And I think they'll really need to be worked out, both a question about having access for everybody, and that has to really be, I think, a fundamental prerequisite for this kind of new e-democracy, or else it won't be democracy, because if not everybody has the tools and knows how to use the tools, and if certain communities are disenfranchised because the information that's available there might not be in their language, then that's not really. I think there's tremendous amount of issues, even if we talk about this theoretically, that really need to be attended to if it's going to become practically possible.
As I call on Jerry, let me remind everybody that last spring, last March, Arizona conducted a Democratic presidential primary in which you could vote on the internet, and there were some restrictions to it. Turnout was 5 times greater than it was in 1996, though, if you will recall, there was no presidential the contest in 96, and Bill Bradley hadn't quite been out of the race by the time the Arizona Democrats went to polls. But 43% voted online.
I think there should be some place where you make people deliberate about decisions. If they sit privately, that seems to be a poor way to decide.
Yeah, certainly lose something in, what is it, all the corporate training and office building exercises. One of them is, a lot of them are variations on the idea that you crash in the middle of the Mojave Desert and you have a certain amount of equipment and what have you that's survived, and you're supposed to prioritize by yourself what you think you need, and then you go with your group, and inevitably the group comes out with a better survival list than you did yourself. Because we all know it, exchanging ideas, strengthen things. I guess a cyber person would say you can have that discussion, you just sit in front of your keyboard and do it. You don't need to be face to face. But
I'd like to, if possible, pose a question to the audience and to the other panelists too. When looking at this whole issue of the internet and the vast possibilities and all the promise that it has, if we look at it maybe symbolically speaking, do you think it's helping us understand each other at all any better? Does it eroding community? Is it promoting isolation for us to sit in front of our computers and perform all our daily tasks and prevent ourselves from engaging in rituals and practices where we have to have some kind of face-to-face interaction? Is that beneficial in any way? We lack community enough as it is. And do you think that this is going to benefit? Or do you think it would have an adverse effect?
I would say that in some of the community centers that we've worked in, in community technology centers, it's really, the way we like to think about it is that it's not an either or. It's really how do we incorporate this in a way that helps to build both relationships with people and how they use these things as tools, not as something that's going to replace the kind of relationships that we find necessary today. And I think that's really the trick, is to really see it as one more kind of dimension in the kind of communication that we have now, not one that's going to replace the kind of communications that we're going to have now.
Now, I suspect there's many people in this room who routinely use the internet. Do you feel closer to the people you exchange emails with, or do you feel distant? Don't make me start picking on people.
Closer, I think. Because people you haven't seen in a while, you can keep in touch. People far away, people you know from across the country. From my experience, those are the only people I ever email.
It's easier to keep in contact via email than it is to get out a paper and place a stamp or place a phone call even. And nowadays there's an instant messaging thing where you can do real live conversational exchanges, and that is probably the way of the future.
But it's interesting, that's always fascinating to me, because one of our panelists brought that up too, that his 14-year-old son communicates with all his friends, and I kept thinking to myself, well, why doesn't he pick up the phone? What is it about that? Are you somehow freer to communicate when you don't have to actually face somebody or hear how they react to you?
It's so much better to engage in a phone conversation, but sometimes you're ready to pound out a letter at 2 a.m. and you're not having to worry about time constraints, depending upon people's schedules or depending upon distances.
But it's the instant messaging that worries me in some senses, because I think what you do miss is that interaction. You hear how somebody responds, and I worry that what we're going to lose is some empathy, the nonverbal cues, the sense that what you're saying and doing affects somebody. It's so removed, and I wonder if it allows you to be meaner, it allows you to be quicker, it allows you to be more superficial. Colder.
The same way that the telephone and or radio allows you to be, that's to the same degree that the face-to-face contact does.
Mm-hmm.
And in politics, the ads on radio are always a lot meaner because there's no visual to go, and it's a lot easier to do an attack ad than it is to do it on television.
Of course, I'm envisioning a computer right now that has instant messaging without a face. I mean, maybe I'm just completely wrong, and we'll have video computers and we'll see each other anyway.
The technology's not very far away.
Right.
It's cool. The video model is very cheap, and you can camera right there. It'll be just like the Jetsons, where you're not going to want to be on there.
Yeah, Mike?
Tim, you know that book by Putnam called Bowling Alone has elicited quite a bit of comment. Now, is e-democracy voting alone? I mean, is it going to intensify the problems that Putnam has put out for public discussion?
Well, my personal opinion is yes, but at the same time, I'm not. As Josh pointed out, he stays in contact with people closer through the email. Not to personalize this too much, but I have a sister, bless her heart, who is cheap. And she lives up in the Northwest, and, I can't get her to call me. and when she does call, it's like, the kitchen timer has been turned over, and under 3 minutes, well, gotta go. On the other hand, her husband has internet. And she now has, for no other reason than the fact that she wants to use, she's totally computer phobic, but she had her husband teach her how to log on to send emails, because now we keep in touch more. Right? Because to her, knowing her, she actually counted out, did the calculations. It's cheaper to do it. Right? And so, in that sense, we can be closer. Now, if you're on an instant, what is it called? Instant
messaging.
Instant messaging with the person next door, you're sick.
Yeah.
If you're Tracy's 14-year-old boy trying to ask a girl out, then it's safe. Yeah, in the back.
I don't think it means you're sick. I live on a college campus where we are next door to one another, and everyone on the college campus has an instant messaging software open virtually all the time. So I have a list in front of me of everyone who is in their room at this time, and I can organize a group of 20 people to go somewhere in under 5 minutes. And it's a very efficient way of getting together, even in close situations. And I have worked in office situations in which the technology does decrease the level of interaction between people who are in the offices, and some tech offices are notorious for the fact that no one ever gets together and has face-to-face conversations, etc. But I've also worked in very tech-centered offices that just work better. People have figured out when is best to send out an email to all the staff on the staff list, and when is best to pick up the phone and call someone directly, when is the best to call a meeting, and have everyone come together. There's ways to use the technology. It's a matter of discretion when you choose to use it, and if you choose to have it take over your life. But it also has tremendous potential. In my family, we have pretty distant cousins that my sister and I now talk to on a fairly regular basis, whereas we would normally have talked about family issues by going up and down the grapevine of the family and having it filtered through all of the adults in our family through 3 levels. And we now have pretty direct conversations about what's going on, and it's going to allow us to stay together as a larger family for several more generations than we would have been able to.
How nervous are your parents about that? Question right here, then over.
I regularly send email messages to my boss, even though he's just relatively few steps away, because it's far more convenient to do that than wait for a time when he has no visitors in his office or when he's off the phone. So it's a way of using my time more efficiently and not interrupting him.
Okay, I withdraw the sick crack.
To bring it full circle back to the legislature, I feel that I work as a librarian, and I see so many ways now. I've been a law librarian for over 10 years. People who were not in touch and had no easy means to find out what the legislature did yesterday or this week or what's coming up next week, they now have easier means to do that. And so I would embrace it, because we did not have and do not have an ideal system. We recognize barriers, and to the extent that it helps us become more participatory and more informed. For example, I was on the California Real Estate Association website for a work-related purpose. They had a nice list of all realty-related bills, which ones were on the governor's desk, which one he signed on the 16th and on the 20th, so they could react to that. And I think they must be communicating more with the legislators, and I know that at least informed people are actually more informed. Those that want to take the steps to be informed, it's easier now, and they become more instantly informed.
Now, one of the things that we talked about in our panel was the speed of this communication, because with email, there's some sense that you need to respond immediately. And so one thing that you lose is the ability to think before you talk and kind of take a deep breath, figure out if it's really what you want to say. Writing a letter lets you do that. Writing an email doesn't seem conducive to that. But I think it's probably back to what you're saying, what somebody else was saying about how you need to figure out when's the right time to use different means of communication, which is an ongoing struggle in my office, God knows.
Well, having been totally chastised, I'll say that if you were doing the instant emailing with your next door neighbor, You're not sick. Necessarily. All right. If you're not organizing the big bowling league. Yeah. Let me share something with you that from the panel that Karen and I were on, which I found was fascinating. I also found it fascinating that anybody actually did the survey. But apparently it was the Pew Trust. And Tracy Westman was saying the Pew Trust recently did a survey. You know, before I tell you, the survey was, I guess, did a content analysis of television shows over the last, period of time. And they wanted to see how different occupations were treated. Right? What was the most crime-prone occupation on TV, in dramas or what have you? Public officials, elected officials, were 2 times greater to be portrayed as criminals than any other occupational group, which presumably, given some of the cop shows, mean that politicians were considered to be more criminal-laden than drug dealers and what have you. 3/4 of all characters on television that portrayed elected officials were done so in a negative fashion. Right. Now, my comment, which no one laughed at to my disappointment, was, when is Senator Lieberman going to take that up with Hollywood? But I think it speaks to some of the comments here about, we talk about representation, we talk about deliberation, we talk about Madison, all of which is fine as long as the population values those things and values people and institutions. Political scientists have known for a long time that everybody hates Congress, but everybody loves their particular representative. Congress as an institution, the legislature as an institution, is not valued. Certainly not valued because I would argue, and I'm a partisan I'm a legislative hack, I'm a groupie of legislatures, I like the legislative process, but they don't deserve the reputation that legislatures have. There was a poll in New Jersey that indicated, asked them of the 100-some members of the New Jersey General Assembly, how many of them do you think are corrupt? And the answer was 95%. That's something else that is driving the e-democracy. And again, one of the things that was commented on our panel was, well, the Constitution isn't what Madison wrote. Right? The Constitution that Madison wrote envisioned wise men selecting the president, a United States Senate that was elected by state legislatures, a vice president that was chosen by wise people called electors that would operate on their own judgment. And so the Constitution itself has become more democratic. We've all become more democratic in so many things, to the point where we don't even say republic too often anymore. But that's not necessarily bad, but also the bad part about it is when it fuels a just automatic negative reaction to anybody holding office. And I know you're all shaking your heads, but I guarantee you that we are in a different situation, and I engaged you in a conversation on something, somebody would say to me, how did you like working in the legislature? All those corrupt guys that just sell their soul for getting reelected. All right, I don't want to end on a damn note like that, so anybody have a final question, and then we can go party?
See, that's why you need the cyber candidate. You won't corrupt him.
Well, personally, I think that, this is an opportunity for there to be more voices heard. And we just need to make sure the conditions are right. So personally, I think there's a lot of hope in this, But we need to be careful about how we do that and make sure that everybody's included.
Absolutely. As Shervin said, much to be wary of, but much to be hopeful for, and there's much opportunity out there. So with that, we'll close it up. The only thing that's left is the reception. We want to go to the reception. It's in the lobby of the Senator Hotel. You just go outside the building here, go down to L Street, cross the light, hang a right, and it's on the corner of the corner, I should know this, I've worked down here for years, 12th. Yeah, 12th and Ellen.
11 to 12 on L Street.
Right. It's also a famous historical site for those of you who are in the California political history. Artie Samish held court in the Senator Hotel when he was the king of the legislature in the late 40s and early 50s, before he went for a vacation with the feds in Leavenworth. It's now an office building. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good trip.
Thank you very much. It's fabulous. It's great. You're doing a great job.
Never interrupt.
No, I don't mind being interrupted at all. I'm Italian. Are you kidding? I think we do democracy.
Thank you.
We do town hall democracy. Everybody's screaming at each other in the hall. It's very nice to meet you. I'm sorry I didn't get to see all your panels. Banana panel?
I get your update.
Bulletin?
Yeah.
Working on that. We're trying to make it a little more interesting.
Well, it's got all those summaries of advisory opinions at the back. That's those I wouldn't.
For those of you in the hearing of my voice, the party is starting now. You don't have to wait till 6.
But they're actually